On the 25th of November 2025, the United States Navy finally admitted that physics cannot be negotiated with. Secretary of the Navy John Phelan signed the execution order for the Constellation-class frigate program. The directive terminated the last 4 ships of the contract for the convenience of the government. Only the 2 hulls currently obstructing the slipways at Marinette Marine will be completed to avoid termination fees. This decision marks the 3rd consecutive generational failure in American surface combatant procurement. Naval historians are already categorizing this era as a full house of failure. The literal combat ship was a disaster of concept, the Zumwalt was a disaster of cost. The Constellation-class, however, is a disaster of execution, a failure to copy a finished homework assignment. The premise was seductive: take the Italian FREMM, a proven European multi-mission frigate, and Americanize it. The goal was 85% commonality to ensure a low-risk, high-speed delivery of 20 hulls. In reality, the commonality collapsed to less than 15% before the first steel was cut. The Navy attempted to force a destroyer's capability set into a frigate's displacement. They demanded Level 2 survivability standards, requiring thicker scantlings and denser shock hardening measures. This structural redesign added 759 tons of parasitic weight to the hull, compromising stability margins. By mid-2024, the Government Accountability Office reported the design was only 70% complete. Yet, the Navy had already authorized construction, welding steel for a ship that existed only in flux. The result was a Franken ship too heavy for its engines and too expensive for its mission profile. At $1.5 billion per hull, the Constellation offered 60% of a destroyer's firepower for 80% of the cost. That math does not survive scrutiny in a budget-constrained environment. European shipbuilders watched in horror as their elegant design was cannibalized by NavSea requirements. One official admitted, "We didn't understand what it meant to adapt a parent design to Navy standards." The integration of the Aegis Baseline 10 combat system required entirely different cable routing and cooling architectures. Every modification created a cascade of secondary engineering problems that stalled the production line. Fincantieri Marinette Marine, struggling with a local labor shortage, could not absorb the constant design churn. Delivery dates slipped from July 2026 to April 2029, a 3-year delay for a rapid acquisition program. The strategic reality is that the U.S. Navy has lost the industrial capacity to design new warships. The engineering talent pool that built the Arleigh Burke class in the 1980s has retired. In their absence, the acquisition corps has become an Ouroboros of requirements, drift, and mismanagement. The cancellation of the Constellation is not just a budget cut, it is an admission of industrial defeat. But the fleet numbers are plummeting, and the timeline for a conflict in the Pacific is shrinking. The Navy cannot wait 10 years to design a clean-sheet frigate from the keel up. Desperate for hulls, the Pentagon has initiated a hard pivot to the only hot production line left. Enter the FFX program, a militarized variant of the U.S. Coast Guard's Legend-class cutter. This is not a warship design, it is a law enforcement platform painted haze gray. But unlike the Constellation, the Legend-class actually exists, floats, and can be built at scale. Huntington Ingalls Industries has already delivered 10 of these cutters from their Pascagoula shipyard. The supply chain is active, the blueprints are stabilized, and the workforce is trained. The plan calls for 50 to 65 hulls to be built across multiple shipyards using distributed modular construction. It is a quantity over quality strategy born from sheer desperation. The FFX displaces 4,600 tons, significantly smaller than the 7,300-ton bloated Constellation design. Critics argue this reduction in volume cripples the ship's future upgrade potential. Power generation limits and magazine depth are dictated by the physical dimensions of the hull, but the Navy argues that a smaller ship in the water is infinitely superior to a perfect ship on paper. The immediate problem is that the Legend class lacks the structural density of a true surface combatant. It is built to commercial standards with limited shock hardening, known as Level 1 survivability. A single anti-ship missile hit that a destroyer might shrug off could be a mission kill for the FF. Retrofitting ballistic steel and redundant systems into an existing hull is an engineering nightmare. To avoid the Constellation trap, the Secretary of the Navy has forbidden major structural changes. The FFX will enter service essentially as a cutter, creating a weird hybrid in the fleet architecture. The most glaring deficiency in this new class is the complete absence of a vertical launch system. Without vertical launch cells, the FFX effectively surrenders the area denial mission profile to the destroyers. It cannot carry the standard missile family for air defense or the ASROC for standoff anti-submarine engagement. The G for guided missile has been stripped from the designation, leaving a hull with neutered reach. Armament is strictly limited to an Mk-110 57mm gun and a ram launcher for self-defense. To compensate for this kinetic deficit, the Navy is betting on the modular Mk-70 Typhoon system. The stern flight deck will host these containerized launchers, effectively bolt-on magazines for Tomahawk cruise missiles. NAVSEA insists this containerized solution avoids the deep structural integration hell that doomed the Constellation redesign. The Typhoon system has been successfully tested on the LCS, offering a plug-and-play offensive strike capability. However, relying on deck-mounted boxes for primary firepower introduces severe compromises in radar cross-section and survivability. Critics immediately recognize the ghostly echoes of the failed literal combat ship mission module concept. The LCS promised interchangeable lethality but delivered decades of technical paralysis and logistical nightmares. Furthermore, placing missile containers on the flight deck cannibalizes aviation operations for the embarked helicopters. This trade-off is critical because the FFX hull lacks an integrated bow-mounted or towed-array sonar suite. A frigate without sonar is blind to the underwater battle space, unable to hunt the submarines it must deter. The ship is entirely dependent on its MH-60 Seahawk or MQ-8 Fire Scout to prosecute subsurface contacts. If the flight deck is cluttered with missile boxes, the primary anti-submarine sensor becomes an operational casualty. The Navy's workaround is to designate the FFX as a mothership for distributed unmanned systems. The strategy shifts the burden of detection and engagement from the hull to a fleet of accompanying drones. This aligns with the Project Overmatch doctrine, but it relies on technology that is not yet mature. We are witnessing a reversion to the Battle Force 2020 concept, but with lower-end platforms. The FFX is not a surface combatant. It is a glorified offshore patrol vessel with blue water endurance. It is a regression from the multi-mission capability of the Oliver Hazard Perry class retired decades ago. Internet commentators have already rebranded the program from FFX to ECS, even crappier ships. Yet, the unclassified intelligence suggests this low-mix fleet is the only viable path to mass. The United States faces a naval construction gap that cannot be closed by complex destroyers alone. In the 1990s, an aircraft carrier took 5 years to build. Today, the timeline stretches to 12. The Arleigh Burke production line is the only functioning heart of American surface warfare industrial capacity. Huntington Ingalls proposed a militarized national security cutter back in 2014, but the Navy rejected it. They arrogantly pursued the gold-plated Constellation instead, ignoring the immediate availability of a warm production line. Now, 11 years later, they are forced to return to that rejected proposal out of sheer necessity. The FFX acquisition strategy relies on distributed shipbuilding to accelerate hull delivery rates. Smaller shipyards will construct modules, which will then be barged to a primary integrator for final assembly. This mimics the successful Japanese and South Korean shipbuilding models, but the U.S. workforce is unproven. Bringing foreign shipyards into the supply chain is politically explosive but likely unavoidable for speed. The timeline demands the first FFX hits the water by 2028 to arrest the fleet's decline. This schedule leaves zero margin for the requirements creep that destroyed the Constellation program. Any change to the baseline Coast Guard design now requires direct approval from the Secretary of the Navy. The mandate is clear. Build the hull first, and figure out the lethality upgrades later. This fly-before-you-buy approach is rare for a Pentagon that prefers purchasing PowerPoint promises, but the FFX faces a threat environment far more lethal than the one the Legend class was designed for. The Red Sea crisis demonstrated that even low-tech drones can saturate a ship's defensive perimeter. A cutter-based hull with commercial survivability standards is a glass cannon in a hypersonics era. It lacks the redundant power generation required for future-directed energy weapons or high-power jamming. The exclusion of shock hardening means a near miss from a ballistic missile could shatter the keel. We are building a fleet of 50 ships that are expendable by design, not by choice. The strategic logic is that a ship that floats is infinitely better than a destroyer that doesn't exist. This is a numbers game trading capability for capacity in a desperate bid to match Chinese shipbuilding. The People's Liberation Army Navy launches the equivalent of the entire French fleet every 4 years. The U.S. Navy, paralyzed by perfectionism, has launched nothing new that works in 20 years. The cancellation of the Constellation is the final tombstone of the post-Cold War transformation era. This leaves the United States Navy with a fleet architecture defined by extreme polarization. We are fielding a high-low mix where the high end is a 10,000-ton destroyer and the low end is a cutter. The middle tier of naval capability, the true multi-mission frigate, has been effectively abandoned. The Constellation was supposed to fill that gap, but it was suffocated by the bureaucracy that birthed it. Kelly Johnson's warning about the Navy driving engineers up a wall has become a prophecy of industrial collapse. The acquisition corps proved incapable of managing a simple modification to a proven foreign design. Now, the fleet must rely on the FFX to conduct low-intensity presence missions and relieve the destroyers. But assigning a cutter to hunt submarines in the North Atlantic is a desperate allocation of resources. The lack of organic sonar forces the fleet commander to rely entirely on external assets for situational awareness. This vulnerability is the price of speed. We traded capability for the certainty of a warm production line. The historical parallel is stark. Between 1975 and 1989, American yards launched 51 Perry-class frigates. That industrial cadence is physically impossible today due to shipyard atrophy and supply chain fragility. The Navy's pivot to the FFX is an implicit admission that the era of complex ship design is paused. We are witnessing the containerization of naval warfare, where the hull is just a truck for missile boxes. This modularity offers flexibility, but it sacrifices the integrated performance of a purpose-built warship. A Mach 70 launcher strapped to a flight deck is a target, not a fully integrated weapon system. Yet, the arithmetic of the Pacific theater demands hulls in the water, regardless of their limitations. A generic hull present in the South China Sea is strategically superior to a perfect frigate in a PowerPoint. The Legend-class design has logged thousands of hours in rough seas. It is a known quantity. By freezing the design, the Navy hopes to bypass the valley of death that claims so many defense programs. If this gamble fails, the burden falls entirely on the aging Arleigh Burke fleet. The Burke remains the only successful surface combatant design the U.S. has produced in 40 years. Critics joke that in the year 2155, the Navy will be launching Flight IX Arleigh Burkes. That joke is becoming a terrifying reality as every attempt to replace it ends in cancellation. The Zumwalt, the LCS, and now the Constellation form a trilogy of procurement disasters. The FFX is the emergency tourniquet applied to a hemorrhaging fleet structure. It is not the ship the Navy wanted, nor the ship the engineers dreamed of building. It is the ship that can be built today, by a workforce that actually exists. Whether a militarized Coast Guard cutter can survive modern naval combat is a hypothesis we must now test. The Constellation is dead. Long live the FFX, the newest member of a reluctant fleet. The era of gold plating is over. The era of steel cutting survival has begun. This is no longer about projecting power with elegance. It is about maintaining presence with volume. The United States Navy has finally stopped fighting its own requirements and started fighting the clock. But in the unforgiving math of great power competition, time is the one resource you cannot print. The cancellation was the easy part. The reconstruction of American sea power is the generational challenge. Until then, the fleet sails with what it has, not what was promised. This is the reality of the Constellation-class legacy.